afternoon. My name is Sam Neiman. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Fremont, Newark, and Union City. This is one of a series of 12 short videos discussing the pros and cons of the propositions on this November's ballot. Today, we'll be speaking about Proposition 14, which extends stem cell research funding here in the state of California. Before I talk about the proposition, though, I would like to say a little about the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. We do not support nor oppose any political party or candidate. What we do is we encourage the active participation in government, and we educate consumers so that they can understand our major public policy issues. And lastly, on issues we have studied and come to consensus on, we will advocate for policy positions. Now, let's go on to Prop 14. This proposition is to extend stem cell research by authorizing $5.5 billion in general obligation bonds to be sold to investors over the next several years. Stem cell research has been very promising. It is a type of regenerative medicine, and it potentially helps many diseases to treat or cure them. Because stem cells can regenerate other cells, tissues, and organs. There has been much research done into everything from arthritis to diabetes. And this is a simple yes or no vote. Do you want to vote for extending stem cell research, or would you rather we not do that? Now let's talk about what this means for us here in the state. First, a little background. Back in 2004, we voters approved Prop 71, and you may remember back then, stem cell research was very controversial, and it was not being done at the federal level. And with Prop 71, what California did was we put it in our Constitution that stem cell research could be done here in the state. In addition to that, we set up the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, or CIRM. With that, there was a governing board deciding who got grants to do research into stem cell, and this board had 3 active working committees to help them govern, help them decide which areas we were going to study, which schools to fund, which organizations, and additionally put in an independent financial oversight. Back then, we approved $3.3 billion. Of that, almost all of it has been sent already. One of the nice things about this proposition, Prop 71 I'm talking about now, was that anyone who got a grant, if they got an invention, if they created a new invention and they were given monies for that, they had to share some of that back to the state. And when monies were shared with the state, which began in 2017, that money goes into the general fund and can be used for any purposes. What does it mean for us now? And you could look at this as, what's the fiscal impact? Let's talk about what new borrowing we're talking about doing. It is $5.5 billion in principal. And that would be general obligation bonds issued to investors around the country. It would take approximately, and this is an estimate now because we're in a new era of bonds. Interest rates are very, very low. 2-3 years ago, you could easily get 3%, 3.5% for a bond. The estimate of $2.3 billion in bond interest is fairly low because of this unique low interest environment we're in. But the total estimated cost over 30 years is $7.8 billion. And that translates into about $260 million every year out of the general fund that cannot be used for other purposes other than paying bondholders. Okay, what are the supporters saying? Initial funding has advanced treatments and cures for lots of diseases. Alzheimer's, diabetes, heart conditions. I know friends who have had stem cells placed in their knees for arthritis treatment. So it's saying we've done a lot of advances of treatments, and that it also increases patient access and affordable treatments for people who go into clinical trials and get access to the medication. Funding to date has actually been good for the state. So of the we invested 2.7 billion so far, and we've generated about 10.7 billion in economic stimulus. So it's kind of a stimulus engine for the state of California. Opponents, they're saying that California cannot afford this during our economic crisis brought on by the pandemic. You've seen how our budgets have been slashed. This is not the time to be spending this kind of money and a commitment for for up to 30 years in paying these bonds. Also, the opponents feel that the previous funding from 2004 has not yielded nearly the promised economic benefits that we the voters were promised in 2004. And lastly, they feel that the CIRM is not transparent enough, nor is it as efficient as it could be in verifying the funds are used properly, funding various studies, that this organization is not as effective as it could be, and this proposition expands the board. Okay, for me, I always find it a little bit difficult to look at the supporting and opposing arguments and trying to figure out and, if you will, suss out what's really happening. So one of the things that I like to do and the league likes to encourage is that you follow the money. And in the state of California, in a couple of different places, and there will be a reference sheet for you at the end of this presentation, you can follow the money yourself. You can go to the Secretary of State's website, where you go into the ballot measure and it will show you contributions and how people are spending and receiving money as low as $5,000. Another area where we are very fortunate is we're one of the few states that has something called the Fair Political Practices Commission. And what the FPPC does is California law requires that any committee or PAC that raises over $1 million and has at least one contributor of over $10,000 reports this to the FPPC, and they report it to us, the voters, through their transparency portal. And sometimes you find some very interesting things. In this one, what I did is I looked at the top donors at the beginning of the month of September. And by the way, this is updated frequently, so it behooves you to take a look at the FPPC site to see what's going on with money contributions to committees and who's actually supporting it. In this one, the supporters were mainly from California. And the top supporter, and I'll have to look at my notes here, the top supporter is the Robert N. Klein II. He was a proponent of Prop 71, and he has committed $3 million of his own dollars to this effort. And he was chair of the Yes on 71 campaign. That was the largest donor. The second largest donor is a philanthropist in Southern California. And I pull out JDRF. And the reason I pulled it out is two reasons. One is they're from New York, so they're from out of state. But when I did a Google search on JDRF, I found that they are an international nonprofit that is providing funding and research to combat type 1 diabetes. So when you look at the top donors, most of them are fighting disease. I did this research on 9/7. But when I was looking for opposition funding about a day or two ago, and we're now getting toward the end of the month, I could find no opposition funding for this measure.
Proposition 15. In its simplest terms, Proposition 15 asks California voters to make a change in property tax assessment that 1, taxes commercial and industrial property at market rate, reassessing no less than every 3 years. And 2, keeps the current rules in place for all residential property and agricultural property. Proposition 15 is a constitutional amendment put on the ballot by petition signatures. It removes commercial and industrial property worth $3 million or more from the property tax limits created in 1978 by Proposition 13. These properties would be reassessed not less than every 3 years. The 1% tax rate established in Proposition 13 would remain. Owners of multiple properties would have the values aggregated in order to determine the $3 million limit. Additionally, that $3 million level would be adjusted for inflation every year. The measure also specifically states that it is not to be interpreted in any way as applying to residential property, either owned or rented. Mixed-use properties will only have the portion that is used for commercial purposes reassessed, and home-based businesses as well as home offices continue to be defined as residential. The measure also gives the legislature the ability, but not the requirement, the ability to define mixed-use properties that are 75% residential to continue to be taxed as residential. Proposition 13 has been amended several times over its life. This amendment modifies the Constitution to create a split roll tax methodology. Our property tax rules were put into the Constitution by Proposition 13. Therefore, this change must come to the voters as another constitutional amendment and must pass with a 2/3 majority vote. The only way to change a constitutional amendment is with a subsequent amendment that is approved by the voters. The legislature cannot act on this matter alone. The fiscal impact of Proposition 15 is significant. Estimates are that an amount between $6.5 billion and $11.5 billion in new funding will be available yearly for schools and local communities. The significance of identifying these funds as new is that they cannot supplant what is already allocated in the budget for these two items. The funds will be allocated to communities and schools based on existing formulas used by the state. The new revenue will be split 40% for schools and community colleges, with that amount shared 89% for schools and 11% for community colleges. The remaining 60% is for counties to allocate among cities and special districts. In 1978, Proposition 13 was passed by the voters to limit the increases in property taxes. Key features were to limit the occurrence of assessment or reassessment to the time of change of ownership rather than on a periodic basis. It established 1% of the purchase price as the initial assessment of the property value and limited tax increases to 2% a year. Any other increase to property tax must be put before the voters, either statewide, such as Proposition 15, or in local communities. One result of this law is that commercial and industrial properties are also only assessed upon change of ownership. Since they do not change ownership with the frequency that residential property does, they can go for years and sometimes decades on old assessments. Supporters argue that this underassessment of commercial and industrial properties is a growing problem and that wealthy commercial property owners are not paying their fair share of local costs in the communities where they are located. It's important to remember that residential and agricultural properties are not included in this measure. Additionally, Proposition 15 puts in place exemptions from current tangible business taxes, and also that small businesses would not be impacted until fiscal year 2025-26. This measure requires that funds generated from Proposition 15 be identified as new revenue that does not replace existing funding for schools and communities, and that is not to be appropriated or transferred for any other use, including is not to be loaned to the general fund. Sources of funding education in 2018-19 were 58% from the state general fund, 22% property taxes, 10% other local sources, 9% federal programs, and 1% from the California lottery. The organizations here are signers of the official ballot measure and include the League of Women Voters of California. Other supporters include SEIU, which is the Service Employees International Union, California Federation of Teachers, and elected officials including Senator Kamala Harris, California State Insurance Commissioner Richard Lara, California Secretary of State Alex Padilla, and Congresspersons Barbara Lee, Karen Bass, and Ro Khanna. There's detailed information on the Yes 15 website. Opponents of Proposition 15 say that the property tax rules enacted through Proposition 13 in 1978 were done so to protect taxpayers from tax assessors' subjective valuation. They also raise concerns that this measure is the first step in repealing Proposition 13 altogether. They argue that businesses will pass on tax increases to consumers as part of their cost of doing business. Even though agricultural land is not included, the businesses that are in the food supply chain are not exempt, which will ultimately increase costs at the grocery store. And small businesses will be hurt. A typical method of renting commercial space is what is known as triple net. This means that payment is based on a price per square foot, plus taxes and insurance, plus common maintenance expenses. Therefore, small businesses will not be protected from paying increased property taxes in the long run. Opponents argue that Proposition 15 will eliminate incentives to build solar energy systems needed to advance California's goals of 100% renewable energy in 2045, create tens of millions of dollars in new administrative costs for local governments, encourages localities to prioritize higher tax commercial and industrial development over affordable housing. California is not business friendly already, with our business tax being third highest in the nation, and that this measure uses property tax to expand the size of government. Some of the organizations opposing Proposition 15 are listed here. They're primarily business focused: the California Small Business Association, California Taxpayers Association, the Business Roundtable, the State Conference of NAACP, the California Farm Bureau, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and the California Restaurant Association. They have more detailed information on their websites, no on proposition15.org and caltax.org. The Proposition 15 is a constitutional amendment, in summary, which requires a 2/3 vote. Supporters advocate for the much needed funding for schools and local communities, projected to be as much as $11 billion a year. And this is based on legislative analyst office estimates. And that it creates more fairness in property tax payments. Opponents argue that increased costs will be passed on to consumers. California business tax is third highest in the nation already, and Proposition 13 was passed to protect taxpayers from assessors' subjective evaluations. Proposition 16. This is a constitutional amendment put on the ballot by the California legislature. It permits state and local government decision-making to address diversity by considering race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. The reason this is on the ballot is because an earlier proposition, number 209, was put on the ballot in 1996 to specifically prohibit such considerations in government decision-making. And the only way to amend a constitutional amendment is with a subsequent constitutional amendment that is approved by the voters. The legislature cannot act on this alone. Proposition 16 repeals a section of the California Constitution which resulted from the earlier proposition. Therefore, it must pass by 2/3 of the voters to become law. Language of the bill includes, it is the intent of the legislature that California remedy discrimination against and underrepresentation of certain disadvantaged groups in a manner consistent with the United States Constitution and allow gender, racial, and ethnic diversity to be considered among the factors used to decide college admissions and hiring and contracting by government institutions. Supporters of Proposition 16 argue that since the passage of Proposition 209 in 1996, there's been about a 40% reduction in women-owned businesses receiving public contracts, a reduction of underrepresented groups admitted to the University of California system, that Proposition 209 overrode a long history of civil rights legislation going back as far as the 1959 California Unruh Civil Rights Act, which was a precursor to the National Civil Rights Act of 1964. And finally, equal opportunity and fairness are fundamental to American democracy. And over the years, programs have been instituted to further these values. This measure was put on the ballot by the legislature and is widely supported by elected officials on both the state and local levels. It's also supported by education and labor leaders and organizations. The Yes on 16 website shows an extensive list. Major funding for promoting this measure comes from the Kaiser Foundation, as well as two philanthropists. Quinn Delaney is founder and former president of the Akonadi Foundation. She's a campaign activist and civil rights lawyer with a long history of working on discrimination, particularly women's issues. Patricia Quillen is a California philanthropist from Santa Cruz. Those who oppose Proposition 16 argue that the current ban on consideration of race, sex, color, ethnicity, and national origin in public education, employment, and contracting is in keeping with the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964. Proposition 209 was approved by the voters in 1996 to ensure equal treatment of all Californians. Further, they argue that this proposition is not the place to address the underrepresentation of any group in higher education. This is the responsibility of both the K-12 system as well as colleges and universities. The key is to prepare students for admission and provide the resources and information they need to access the opportunities available to all. They argue this measure reinforces identity politics and is counter to the fundamental ideal we have that everyone should be treated under the law, equally under the law. They say Proposition 16 is divisive and discriminatory, and its implementation will put a political band-aid on some deeper socioeconomic challenges at best. Opponents and funders of Proposition 16 include the most well-known is Ward Connerly, former UC regent. He's widely known for his for actively promoting Proposition 209 in 1996 to make all discrimination illegal. And major funding for promoting this opposition to this measure comes from Students for Fair Admissions, which is an organization that advocates for eliminating race as a criteria in college admissions. In summary, there are three important points to remember. First, this is a constitutional amendment, so it must take, it requires 2/3 majority of the voters to pass. Secondly, supporters believe this measure creates more openness and opportunities for people. It fights discrimination and racism and brings back affirmative action activities. Opponents believe this measure creates preferential treatment and that the voter approved Proposition 209 from 1996 should not be overturned by the legislature.
Let's now look at Proposition 17. This is a voting rights initiative, and if passed by the voters, it would restore the voting rights of Californians who are on parole. In California, ballot measures come to us either from the legislature or through the initiative process, and this came to us through the initiative signature gathering process. Prop 17 would amend the California Constitution, and like all ballot propositions, this is a yes or no vote. It asks the voters, should the California Constitution be amended to allow citizens who are on parole to register and to vote? Let's look at some background information. How are things now? Well, as we know, in California, the Constitution allows most US citizens who are aged at least 18 to register and vote. But when someone has finished serving time for a serious crime in a state prison, they often spend time on supervised parole when they get out. Parolees must adhere to certain conditions, such as there are restrictions on where they can live, they are subject to searches, and they complete a rehabilitation process, and they must meet regularly with their parole officers. Parole usually lasts for 3 years. Right now, the Constitution does not allow those serving on parole after they've completed their time in state prison to vote. Currently, there are about 50,000 formerly incarcerated people on parole in the state of California, and they are not allowed to vote. Until 1974, voting rights were permanently revoked forever for all Californians who were convicted of a serious crime. But after 1974, the law changed and people were allowed to vote. Their voting rights were restored after they completed parole, after they completed those 3 years of parole. So now Prop 17 is looking at this again, and they are asking the voters to decide whether those leaving incarceration and beginning parole should be able to vote. It needs to be said that in California, there are racial disparities in arrest and sentencing. There are a greater number of Blacks, 26% on parole, than their percentage in the population, which is only 6% in California. Whereas the white population on parole is also 26%, but the white population in California, adults as a whole, is 40%. Whether or not Proposition 17 passes, it must be restated that those currently serving time in prison will not be allowed to vote. Prop 17 only concerns those who are on parole after completing their prison sentence. If Proposition 17 passes, there will be fiscal impacts. Okay, let's look and see what they are. Implementing Prop 17 is likely to cost both the states and the counties some money. As more people register to vote, the people on parole, if they register to vote, each year it will cost the counties some money to send out ballots and voting material to these newly registered voters. And it will also cost the state a one-time amount of money to update the voting systems. It's likely that it would be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. As with all ballot measures, there are supporters, and there are also people who are opposed. Let's look at their arguments. Supporters of Prop 17 say that when a person leaves prison, they should be encouraged to rebuild their lives and re-enter society. And voting helps them do this by providing them a feeling of having a real stake in their society and in their communities. These people who are on parole have families, they have jobs, and they pay taxes, but yet they're not, they're not able to vote on issues of importance. Also, they argue there was a study done in the state of Florida that found that people who had completed their prison sentences and had their voting rights restored were actually less likely to reoffend. And finally, there are 19 other states in the United States that allow people on parole to vote. It takes money to get something on the California ballot and for the supporters to bring their case to the people. So let's see who the supporters and funders are of Prop 17. Okay, Free the Vote is an organization that sponsored Prop 17, and you can see their website. You can visit it if you wish. Also, Carol Moon Goldberg, who is the president of the League of Women Voters of California, supports Proposition 17, as do Kevin McCarty, who's an assembly member and the author of Prop 17, and Jay Jordan of Californians for Safety and Justice. And the money, well, Prop 17 was funded by two wealthy philanthropists, Susan Pritzker and Patty Quillen, and also the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California. Well, what are the opposing arguments? The opponents of Prop 17 say, if Prop 17 passes, it will allow those convicted of very serious crimes to vote before completing their entire sentence, and the entire sentence includes parole. They also say that parole is part of an offender's sentence, and during parole, offenders are monitored, they're supervised, and they should actually prove that they've been rehabilitated before any voting rights have been restored. And finally, they argue that it's the victims of crime who deserve the justice, and granting voting rights prior to completion of the entire sentence is not justice. Let's look and see who opposes Prop 17. The election materials listed 3 individuals. You can see them here. And Prop 17 had no major, the opponents of Prop 17 had no major funders. So in summary, let's see. Voting yes on Prop 17 means you believe that the California Constitution should be amended to allow people on parole to have their voting rights restored. And voting no means that you believe that people on parole should not have their voting rights restored, and allowing the California Constitution to remain as is. So we get to vote on this. The people decide. Now let's look at Prop 18. This is a voting initiative, and if passed by the voters, would allow 17-year-olds to vote in primary and special elections. In California, ballot measures are brought to the voters either through the initiative process or by the legislature. And this particular one was brought to us by the legislature. Prop 18 is a yes or no vote. as are all propositions in California. It would amend the California Constitution. And it asks the voters to decide, should the California Constitution be amended to allow citizens who are 17 years old to vote in special elections and primary elections if they will turn 18 by the next general election, which is held in November. Let's get a little background on this topic. How are things now? Well, as we know, in order to vote in California, a citizen has to be at least 18 years old on the date of the election. And this is pretty interesting. I didn't know this, but a citizen may pre-register to vote at age 16 or 17. And when they are pre-registered, they are automatically registered by the time they turn 18. An interesting statistic is, by the end of June in 2020, just a few months ago, there were about 108,000 17-year-olds in California who pre-registered to vote. Something else that was interesting that came up during my research is that the state law allows any registered voter to run for elective office. So if this measure passes, it is conceivable that 17-year-olds could serve as elected representatives if they meet other eligibility requirements for that office. Special elections are those called by the governor to fill vacancies. Primary elections are held in even-numbered years, as are the general elections. So this is an even-number year, 2020. We had a primary, and now we have a general election. Local government elections and ballot measures are generally held during those even-numbered year cycles. If Prop 18 passes by the voters, what would be the fiscal impact? There's always a cost. Implementing Prop 18 would likely cost both the counties and the state of California some money, although it is felt to be a minor amount. The workload for county elections officials would increase due to the larger number of people registering to vote. In each 2-year cycle, the cost to the counties could be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And additionally, a one-time cost to the state of California, also felt to be minor, would likely also be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that would be for updating existing voter systems. The cost to the state would likely be less than 1% of the current state general fund spending. As with all ballot measures, there are supporters and there are opponents. And let's look at what they say. Let's look at the supporters' arguments now. Supporters of Prop 18 say that Prop 18 will allow 17 and 18-year-olds to participate in the full election cycle, from the primary election to the general election. They argue that when people cannot vote in the primaries, it discourages them from voting in the general election because they didn't have a say in the pick. They didn't have a say in who would be on the ballot. They also say that youth of this age are heavily impacted by policy decisions and their voices need to be heard. Youth are very interested and passionate about certain issues, and they should be allowed to vote. They continue by saying Prop 18 encourages young people to be involved in the voting process. And youth voting can create lifelong voters and participants in our democracy. And finally, there are many other states that allow 17-year-olds to vote. We would not be the first. We would not be the first to allow 17-year-olds to vote in primary and special elections. It takes money to get a proposition on the ballot, and also for supporters to make their cases to voters. So let's see who the supporters and the funders are for Proposition 18. Prop 18 is supported by two assembly members, Kevin Mullen and Evan Lowe. They are the sponsors of this proposition. And Prop 18, their major funders are, again, Kevin Mullen for Assembly, and a committee that was developed by Evan Lowe, the Assembly member. Labor unions are in favor of this. They were major funders, as well as the California Democratic Party. Now let's look at some of the arguments against Prop 18. Opponents say 17-year-olds are not workers, they don't pay taxes, and they have no life experience in these matters and should not be allowed to vote on fiscal matters. They also say that people of this age are minors and their brains are not fully developed. They don't have the reasoning ability, logic, or the judgment necessary to form opinions on important matters. They also say that 17-year-olds are still in high school. They spend a lot of their time, much of their time actually, with their teachers who would have an undue influence over them. And they say also that only 18 other states allow 17-year-olds to vote in primary and special elections. Who's opposed to Prop 18? This is a common one, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, and an organization called the Election Integrity Project of California. As far as funding the opposition to Prop 18, there were none noted that of major funders. So in summary, voting yes on Prop 18 means that you believe that the California Constitution should be amended to allow 17-year-olds to vote in primary and special elections if they will turn 18 by the next general election. And a no vote means that you believe the Constitution should not be amended to allow 17-year-olds to vote, thereby keeping the Constitution as it is on this issue. So we get to vote on this.
The question at hand is, should our Constitution be changed to modify the rules for transferring property assessed values and use resulting new tax revenues for wildfire agencies, schools, and local government? We need a little background here. Proposition 13 passed in 1978. It set limits both on the assessed value and tax rates, rolling back assessed values to 1975 market rates. Changes in ownership cause a reassessment to current market value. What exemptions exist? This proposition has been modified a couple of times. Back in 1986, Prop 58 passed, protected certain property transfers from reassessment, and that was on the transfer of property from parents to children. Later, in 1996, Prop 5 passed and gave very similar protections if the property was being passed from grandparents to grandchildren if the parents were no longer living. These transfers had to occur within 2 years. Now, since Prop 13 passed in 1978, people 55 years and older, severely disabled or displaced by a natural disaster known as eligible persons are allowed a once-in-a-lifetime benefit of buying a new home of equal or lesser value and to transfer their tax base only between or among certain counties. I believe there are 10 counties today. Some of them include Alameda, Santa Clara, San Mateo, LA, Riverside. So there is a limited number of counties where people 55 and older, severely disabled, or displaced by a natural disaster can once in their lifetime move and maintain their current tax base. So let's see what else will happen. If Prop 19 passes, there will be expanded special rules for eligible homeowners. And the homeowners, starting on April 21st, eligible homeowners will be able to transfer their property tax values to a new home anywhere in the state, as opposed to the limited number of counties that we have today. They will be able to purchase a more expensive home as opposed to one of equal or lesser value. And they will be able to do this 3 times, with the exception of a person who is being displaced by a natural disaster. That will continue to be a one-time benefit. Prop 19 also changes the special rules for inherited properties. It ends special rules for properties not used as an owner-occupied home or farm. So there will be a reassessment of inherited property unless it is owner-occupied. And after 2/16/2023, owner-occupied properties with a market value of more than $1 million greater than its taxable value would be reassessed at market value at time of the transfer. Okay, so let's look at that. That's if you're an owner-occupied home or farm, you do not get reassessed unless you are a high-value property and your property is worth more than $1 million of its value. Taxed value. And lastly, it will use the additional taxes for wildfire agencies. And those wildfire agencies will be the primary beneficiary, getting 75% for fire suppression and the rest to go to schools and local governments. What are the fiscal effects? It is expected there will be increased revenues for school and local governments based on the taxing of inherited properties. There will be increased revenues for fire suppression. We'd love to suspend fires, wouldn't we? No, for increased revenues for fire suppression. And then we do expect the state costs to go up yearly in the tens of millions of dollars per year. Let's look at who's supporting this. The supporters are saying this is going to help our seniors, our disabled, and those displaced. It closes tax loopholes on inherited property. So people who inherited property today can maintain a very low tax base based on what their parents or grandparents were doing for an owner-occupied property and other property up to $1 million. It provides increased revenues for fire suppression, local governments, and schools. And if you wish, you can look at this website for more information on supporting arguments. I put up all these supporters because there was not enough money generated in this proposition for FPPC tracking, and I'll talk about that a little later. But if you look at this, there are a number of people supporting this. It's an interesting mix of firefighters, realtors. It's obvious this is going to help these people. But I want you to note one thing, because I find this very interesting, is one of the supporters is a former policy director for the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. This association almost always opposes any new taxes. Let's look at the opponents now. The opponents are saying the Constitution has been amended 3 times to protect the right to pass homes up to $1 million of other property to their heirs without changing any tax assessments. And reassessments will force families to sell their property due to that higher assessment. As of 9/11/2020, there was no active website or ballot measure committee, so I don't have any to show you. Look at the opponents. The opponents, and this again is so interesting to me because it's the current president of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, Patricia Bates, State Senator, District 36, and Ken Cooley, Assemblyman, District 8. Let's go on. And last, what I like to do is see where the money is coming from in support of these propositions. As you can see, the most money coming into the fund for support is coming from realtors. And of course, they believe they will benefit from this because people will be moving more frequently with less tax implications. No opposition committee has raised enough money to be tracked by the FPPC. One committee did raise over $45,000. The FPPC is the Fair Political Practices Commission, and we are very lucky to have that here in the state of California, because any committee or PAC that raises over $1 million and has at least one contributor of $10,000 or more must report who those contributors are to the state of California, and that is available to us, the voters.
This measure, Proposition 20, was put on the ballot by petition signatures and is an initiative statute. It makes changes to current law that was put on the books by AB 109 and previously approved Propositions 47 and 57. Certain theft and fraud offenses that were previously made misdemeanors could now be charged as either misdemeanors or felonies. DNA would be collected from people convicted of a variety of crimes, including some which were redefined as misdemeanors. It also creates criteria for the Board of Parole hearings to use in considering whether to grant parole to an inmate convicted of nonviolent crimes, and would eliminate parole in certain instances. The state of California was under a federal court order to reduce prison overcrowdedness. To comply, the state passed AB 109 in 2011 to move prisoners convicted of certain nonviolent crimes from state prison to county jails. Later, in 2014, the voters approved Proposition 47, which redefined some nonviolent crimes as misdemeanors and allowed resentencing for people convicted under those crimes. And lastly, in 2016, the voters approved Proposition 57, which allowed parole for certain nonviolent felons. The importance of parole is that prisoners meeting eligibility may have the ability to be released early and be supervised in the community by parole or probation officers. Proposition 20 also gives law enforcement the flexibility on how to charge some crimes. Certain theft and fraud crimes that were changed from felonies to misdemeanors under Proposition 47 would now be charged as either. These are known as wobblers. This measure also establishes the categories of serial crime and organized retail crime, which could also be charged as wobblers. This makes a difference in sentencing and whether a person is incarcerated in prison or jail. And it also expands the list of crimes defined as violent and therefore not covered by Proposition 57 opportunities for parole and/or early release from prison. Supporters of this measure view it as a public safety initiative. By defining more crimes as violent and restricting parole, then more dangerous people would be placed in or remain in prison. They argue against the idea that costs would increase because convicts would remain incarcerated for their entire original prison sentence and not be released to the community early. These costs would need to be accounted for from the beginning of sentencing. They see this as a tool to reduce repeat crimes. Some of the organizations supporting Proposition 20 are Keep California Safe, which is a project of the California Public Safety Partnership Issues Committee. Major funding is from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Employees Benefit Association, and the Devin Nunes Campaign Committee. Their website is yeson20.org. Opposing arguments are that Proposition 20 will roll back prison reforms that have taken place over the years. The legislative analyst estimates that it will also cost tens of millions of dollars in additional court costs and incarceration expenses. They also argue that violent prisoners currently serve long sentences and are not released early on probation or parole. This measure is not necessary. It will result in the need for more prisons and/or return to levels of overcrowding that caused the federal lawsuit to begin with. This is a waste of taxpayer dollars. Overspending on prisons cuts into mental health funds for crime survivors, as well as programs for prisoners. Prison reform in recent years has included mental health services and rehabilitation programs that have been effective. And investments here, rather than in more incarceration, are better for everyone. Opponents include Chief Probation Officers of California, Partnership to End Domestic Violence, California Teachers Association, and the ACLU. Major funding is from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and Patty Quillen, who is a California philanthropist from Santa Cruz, and Stacy Schusterman, who is a philanthropist from Oklahoma. So in summary, Proposition 20 limits the right to parole in certain instances and creates state and local increased costs. Supporters argue that this measure is necessary to ensure that violent criminals are not released early, and opponents argue that violent criminals serve severe sentences, and this measure is not necessary and undermines current reforms.
Now on to the proposition. During the 1970s and 80s, with rental costs increasing, 13 cities adopted rent control ordinances. These varied from city to city. In 1996, the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act became law. The question now is, do we want to change the current state rent control laws? A yes vote means we will change those and the rules will change. A no vote means the rules will stay the same. Currently, about 20% of Californians live in cities with rent control rules. And this is important for our landlords. Court rulings have ruled that rent control laws must allow landlords to receive a fair rate of return. Here I have a side-by-side comparison of what the current situation is and what would happen if Prop 21 passes. So right now, Costa-Hawkins has three main limits on rent control. A single-family home cannot go under rent control. There are no rent controls on properties built after February 1st, 1995, and there is no limit on rent increases when a new tenant moves in. A newer state law limits rent increases. That law is in effect until 2030. Now, if Prop 21 passes, the new rules amend contra Costa-Hawkins. Cities and counties could pass new rules for properties more than 15 years old. They can limit the rent increases to 15% or more, and it applies to landlords with housing units of greater than 2 housing units. And what that means is it applies to landlords with single-family homes. And as before, it requires landlords to receive a fair rate of return. Let's look at the fiscal effects, and these are rather challenging to determine because it depends on what local communities, the cities, the counties do. If they expand rent control, the longer term effect could be higher rent in existing properties. the quality may decrease. And with that decrease in quality, the property values may decrease. And that would be because landlords might decide to reduce maintenance to kind of work on cost. So the other thing that could happen is renters would move less often. And these are the economic effects that we think could happen, and it really depends on whether cities and counties impose stricter rent control rules. Okay. What is it in terms of revenue and cost for the cities and the state? The measure is likely to reduce state and local revenues over time, property tax being the largest effects. If communities that already have rent control expand to include more property, revenue losses could be in the high tens of millions of dollars per year. This could increase, and it could also increase local government cost if the rent control is expanded. These costs would be from very little to tens of millions of dollars per year, depending on whether the cities and counties expand, because they would have to pay more for their rent control boards. Supporting arguments. As rents rise, people are forced from their communities. This is being made worse in the pandemic. The skyrocketing rents have led to over 150,000 homeless people living on the streets. The burden of these homelessness falls on taxpayers. Many people are having trouble finding homes that they can afford. Teachers, nurses, seniors, vets are struggling to find housing. It also protects some single-family homeowners, those homeowners who have less than 3 properties. So 1 or 2 properties are protected, and it does guarantee landlords a profit, as the old law did. The opposing arguments. It makes the California housing crisis worse because by that we would have less housing available and the less affordable housing. And they believe it will make housing values go up by 20% in terms of rental costs. It doesn't address affordable housing, but it hurts homeowners. And within the law itself, there are no protections for seniors, vets, or the disabled. And lastly, 60% of voters rejected Prop 10 in 2018. Wow. Looking at the supporters and opponents of this is a tough one. There are so many organizations involved and who want to be, who are making not only their voices heard, but putting their money where the mouth is, and I'll get into that in a minute. And I would recommend that you spend a little time looking at the supporting and opposing arguments beyond what I have put here. You can look at them in the Secretary of State Voter Guide and the League of Women Voters Easy Voter. Another one is Voter's Edge. A reference of nonpartisan websites is at the end of this presentation. I did a deep dive into who was supporting and opposing this, and I think what you need to do is take a look for yourself, and you may want to do a little more research on this than what is currently available in this video. So one of the things we always recommend is look at where the money is coming from. There is a wealth of money both in support of this and in opposition. Now, the information I have up here is the top donor information, which is provided to us by the Fair Political Practices Commission. And this is an organization within the state that tracks the donations and top donors of people into committees and PACs. that managed to get over $1 million in donations and has at least one donor of over $10,000. This particular data is from 9/17. The FPPC updates their data frequently, and because of that, I recommend you take a look at it right before the election. You can drill down even further if you choose, and I did for this. One of the supporting PACs collected over $16.5 million from small donors and the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which was the highest donor. One of the PACs, an opposing PAC, was the Issues PAC of apartment owners of Greater LA. They collected over $260,000 from 500 plus, mostly small dollar donors. I failed to note that when I drilled down in the supporting PAC, though the AIDS Healthcare Foundation was the highest donor, there were also hundreds of small donors. Now on to the proposition. This proposition exempts app-based rideshare and delivery companies, companies like Uber, companies like DoorDash, from providing employee benefits to certain drivers. This is an initiative statute, so it only requires a majority approval to pass. Let's look at the proposal directly. Effective in 2020, a law, Assembly Bill 5, passed in the legislature in 2019, established who is an employee versus who is a contractor. Employees typically get many more benefits, lots more benefits, because independent contractors don't get any benefits. The only benefit an independent contractor has is that they have, they control their own destiny. They decide when to work, where to work, how many hours a week they'll work, things like that. Whereas employees, they are working at the schedule of their employee, but they do get sick leave, they get paid time off, they get holidays. It's a much different situation between an independent contractor or a gig worker and an employee. AB 5 used a three-part test. Is a person free from company control? Do they perform work outside the company's core business? And are they customarily engaged in the trades? And under this definition, gig drivers, rideshare drivers, and delivery drivers become employees. And that's very important for this proposition, because this proposition would like to change that. So rather than Uber, Lyft, DoorDash drivers becoming employees, they would remain independent contractors. Now, during the crafting of this legislation, there were many organizations that work with labor, and they worked to make sure they were outside of the auspices of AB 5. They would be people like professional dentists, doctors, conductors, certain artistic professions are not covered by the law AB 5, so they are not affected by this either. So what this proposal is that drivers stay independent contractors, but in addition to that, they will get some benefits from the companies they work with. The driver's pay would go up to 20% over minimum wage for any time driving, and they would receive 30 cents a mile for any driven miles. They would get a healthcare subsidy. That healthcare subsidy, if the drivers are driving at least 25 hours a week, would be the amount up to 82% of an average covered California healthcare policy. If the drivers are working between 15 and 20 hours a week, they would get a subsidy, but it would be lower. And there would be additional medical coverage provided for drivers for injuries on the job. Drivers would be provided with insurance to cover medical expenses and lost income up to $1 million for any injury that occurred on the job. Also, there would be disability insurance for drivers, which would give them up to 66% of their pay if they are disabled on the job. Lastly, what I have written up here is it restricts drivers to only 12 hours a day, and this is a safety protocol. There are a couple other safety protocols that I don't have up on the screen, and these companies would have to prohibit workplace discrimination. They would have to require the companies to develop sexual harassment policies. I always like the way that's written. We would not have them develop policies for sexual harassment, but against sexual harassment. And to conduct criminal background checks on all the drivers. Lastly, mandate safety driving, safety training for the drivers. So those are the things that the companies would give, and in this case, the drivers would stay independent contractors. There's one other little tidbit here that I find kind of interesting. It stays the ability of local jurisdictions to make any changes to the employment status of the drivers. They can't ask for anything more or less. So what are the fiscal effects for the state? Well, basically, not very much. We might get some higher income tax receipts because the drivers would be making more money. But it's really the companies who would bear the higher cost in providing benefits defined in Proposition 22. Right now, these drivers get, under current law, this is a little confusing, this one. Under current law, AB 5, drivers are employees. However, that is being litigated through the courts right now. The state, as I said, has been suing these companies to start treating these drivers as employees. But under current state law, companies are supposed to be giving full employee benefits. Okay, but there is really very low impact to the state. So let's look at the supporting arguments. Classifying the drivers as employees will give higher prices and less access to delivery services for the public at large. And again, I have to stress a yes on this. Drivers stay independent contractors with some additional benefits that they have not had prior to AB 5. Okay, it protects drivers seeking part-time work, it brings new benefits to drivers, and it provides more protection for customers. Those protections are the limit on the number of hours driven, the background checks, and the driver safety training. Okay, so let's, did that a little strangely. Now let's look at the opposing arguments. The opposers, the people opposing this are saying it eliminates basic workplace protections, replacing them with a lower guaranteed earnings and health care. Again, a no on 22 says we consider gig drivers, rideshare drivers, delivery drivers as employees of companies like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash. The current law does not reduce driver flexibility, and companies should not get to pick what laws they want to pay attention to, or basically write their own. And what the opponents are saying is they are writing their own laws with this proposition. So it's sometimes challenging to figure out, you know, as you're reading the supporting and opposing arguments, and to suss out what's really going on. So what I like to do is I like to look at the money. Where's the money flowing in support and opposition of these arguments? There's a couple ways you can do that. You can go to the Secretary of State website, and there you can drill down into the ballot measure and see quite a number of ways of looking at the finances. You can actually look at Voters Edge, a league website, and get that information as well. I am also very interested in a website called the FPPC, the Fair Political Practices Commission website. They have a transparency portal that lets us look into where monies are flowing into committees and PACs. And when I looked at the money in this one, the things that I found most interesting when I looked, and these websites are updated with new information quite frequently, so you may want to look at them right before you vote. But when I looked at the FPPC transparency portal a few days ago, there was about $183 million for the support of this. And all of those contributions came from the app-based rideshare delivery companies. In the opposition, which brought in about $7.5 million when I looked, were mostly labor unions here in California and those headquartered in DC as well. So this gives you kind of an idea who's favoring this, who's against it, and it kind of helps you make up your mind if you know who is putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak.
This presentation is about Prop 23, and it concerns the regulation of kidney dialysis clinics. Specifically, the measure establishes minimum staffing and other requirements. In the state of California, propositions can come either from the legislature or from the initiative process, and this is from the initiative process. To evaluate this proposition, it is important to understand what dialysis is. In order for people with kidney failure to survive, they must receive a kidney transplant or go on dialysis. Because of the lack of available donor kidneys, most will go on dialysis. And this is a process that uses a machine to filter the blood to remove waste, toxins, and excess water. It involves a small surgical procedure where a blood vessel is expanded in the patient's arm to provide access. During dialysis, blood is pumped through soft tubes to a dialysis machine where it goes through a special filter called a dialyzer. As the blood is filtered, it is returned to the bloodstream. Treatment is typically done in a chronic dialysis clinic 3 times a week, with each treatment lasting up to 4 hours. The lives of patients on dialysis can be extended for years. However, it is life-threatening to not receive the required schedule of dialysis 3 times a week. To address patients' needs, clinics often operate 6 days a week for extended hours. And this is what it looks like. As a retired public health nurse, I feel compelled to share with you that the major cause of kidney failure is poorly controlled high blood pressure and diabetes. And that's why it's very important for everyone to periodically have their blood pressure and blood sugar checked, and if they are out of control, to keep them well controlled. Kidney failure is usually a slowly progressive disease without symptoms. The ballot summary. This ballot requires that at least one licensed physician be on site during all hours when patients are receiving treatment. An exemption may be granted if no qualified physician is available, but a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant must be on site. It requires clinics to report dialysis-related infection data to state and federal governments. It prohibits clinics from closing or reducing services without state approval. It also prohibits clinics from refusing treatment to patients based on their source of payment. Clinics are licensed by the California Department of Public Health. Federal certification standards are used to provide minimum safety guidelines. Federal licensing regulations for dialysis clinics require that each patient be visited by his or her physician at the clinic at least once a month. There is also a requirement that each clinic employ a medical director, and this position is estimated to be 1/4 time. That implies that one physician could rotate as medical director among several different clinics. There are about 588 licensed clinics in California. As of May 2018, approximately 80,000 people in California rely on dialysis clinics for treatment. 72% of all clinics are owned and operated by DaVita Incorporated and Fresenius Medical Care. These are private, for-profit companies. And it is estimated that the annual revenue of private companies is $3 billion. Payment for dialysis treatments come from a variety of sources, and these are sometimes intertwined. Medicare pays for most treatments. Medi-Cal also covers a portion of dialysis treatments for patients who are indigent and have no other health insurance. These government programs set reimbursement rates for dialysis treatments. Those rates are largely set by regulation and are close to the clinic operator's average cost for each treatment, which somewhat limits clinic operators' profit margins. The fiscal effect. Prop 23 would increase costs for clinics because a physician would have to be present during all treatment hours. These costs would be passed on to the current primary payers, Medicare and Medi-Cal. The legislative analyst estimates that costs to state and local governments could be tens of millions of dollars annually. The new data reporting requirements would not significantly increase costs. In 2018, Prop 8 also dealt with dialysis, but regarding a different issue. Prop 8 capped profits and required a refund to patients or patient payers, whereas Prop 23 addresses physician staffing, data reporting, and clinic closures. Both propositions were supported by the SEIU UHW West, a labor union for healthcare workers, and they reflect a conflict between the union and the state's two largest dialysis business, DaVita and Fresenius. Prop 8 was defeated by 60% of voters. Supporting arguments. Patients should have access to a physician on site whenever dialysis treatment is being provided. Proper reporting and transparency of the infection rate encourages clinics to improve quality. And strong protections should be provided to vulnerable patients when clinics close. Supporters and funders. The California for Kidney Dialysis Patient Protection is a political action committee funded solely by the Union Service Employees International Union United Healthcare Workers. It is noteworthy that the union hired a company, Kimball Petition, to collect signatures for this measure. A total of approximately $5.5 million was spent to collect the required 623,212 valid signatures to put this measure before the voters. And this resulted in a total cost per required signature of $8.86. Yes on Prop 23 has raised a little over $6 million. Prop 23 would make the opposing arguments. Prop 23 would make the physician shortage worse by diverting physicians to dialysis clinics, leaving hospitals and clinics without adequate physician staffing. Because of the increased financial cost involved in Prop 23, clinics would be forced to cut services, putting lives at risk. Dialysis clinics are strictly regulated and provide high-quality care. According to Dr. Jeffrey Perlmutter, president of the Renal Physicians Association, every dialysis patient is under the care of a physician kidney specialist, and dialysis treatments are administered by specially trained nurses and technicians. It makes no sense to require physician administrators on site full-time. Furthermore, he says, this physician is not required to be specially trained in dialysis care. According to the Federal Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services, California dialysis clinics outperform other states in clinical quality and patient satisfaction. No on Prop 23. Stop the dangerous and costly dialysis proposition. This is a political action committee. In addition to opposition by DaVita and Fresenius Medical Care, there is a long list of organizations that oppose this proposition. Major ones include California Medical Association, Nurses Association, the Academy of Nephrology Physicians Assistant, the California State Conference of the NAACP. And the list of organizations can be found on the website listed on this slide. The total money raised is over $73 million, mostly by dialysis corporations. Thank you for watching this presentation and for being involved in our democratic process.
Let's take a look at the proposition now. This initiative amends the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA of 2019. This act is considered one of the most comprehensive in the country. What we will do is look at these 4 areas. The top 3 we will look at in more detail in following slides. So what does this proposition do? It reduces the number of businesses required to meet data privacy rules. It gives consumers new privacy rights. It changes the existing penalties, stiffening them, and it limits the use of penalty revenues. Lastly, it creates the California Privacy Protection Agency to additionally enforce and implement consumer privacy laws and impose fines where needed. Let's look at the businesses affected. The current CCPA applies to businesses that buy, sell, or share for business purposes the personal data of 50,000 or more consumers, households, or devices annually. Proposition 24 would no longer count devices, and it increases the annual threshold to 100,000 or more consumers or households. The other 2 bullets, the earning 25 million in revenue or more and earning 50% or more in annual revenue from selling personal data information, is the same as before. And look at the consumer protections. It permits consumers to prevent businesses from sharing personal information. We can correct our inaccurate personal information, and it limits the business's use of sensitive personal data. That includes precise geolocation, race, ethnicity, and health information. The consumer has to opt out of any sale or sharing of information. We talked about penalties changing. This is the stiffening. We had the CCPA provides a 30-day grace period to fix violations. Under this proposition, that is removed. There are up to $2,500 per violation and up to $7,500 for violations of persons under the age of 16. And lastly, a $750 per consumer per data breach incident, or the actual damage, whichever is greater or higher. And we noted earlier, Prop 24 limits the use of penalty revenues. The proceeds from fines under Prop 24 would be deposited into the Consumer Privacy Fund, which will be used to offset costs to courts, the Attorney General, and the California Privacy Protection Agency that are associated with enforcing consumer data law. What are the fiscal effects? Okay, there's going to be increased state cost of at least $10 million annually for the new CPPA. This is the new agency that gives teeth to oversee and impose fines to enforce our privacy laws. The increased state costs are not likely to exceed the low millions of dollars annually for increased court costs and the Department of Justice enforcement workload. Some or all of these costs would be paid by penalties collected for violations of consumer privacy laws. It's unknown what the impact on state and local revenue taxes would be because of the economic effects resulting from new requirements on businesses to protect consumer data. What are the supporters saying? It protects most of your personal data. And with that higher fines for young people, it safeguards the young people. It puts limits on what personal data can be collected. And it establishes that enforcement agency. If you want to get more information on that, look at caprivacy.org. Some of the supporters include Alistair McTaggart and his wife, Celine. They are the creators of a group called Californians for Consumer Privacy. Common Sense Media, a group that promotes safe use of media and technology for children. Consumer Watchdog, Alice Huffman, President of the California NAACP, and Representative Ro Khanna, Democrat of Fremont. Now, what are the opponents saying? The opponents believe it reduces rights under the current law. It gives businesses a new way to collect information through health and financial apps. It allows businesses to charge you more if you opt out of providing your personal data. It lacks the backing of a broad coalition of privacy advocates. Here is the website for looking at the opposing arguments. Some of those opposing this proposition are the American Civil Liberties Union, Public Citizen, Consumer Federation of California, Dolores Huerta, Labor and Civil Rights Leader, and the Orange County Register Editorial Board. Now, let's take a look at where most of the money is coming from for both the support and opposition. The support has received from Alistair McTaggart over $5 million, and what I was able to see as of September 17th was all of the support monies came from Mr. McTaggart. In opposition, no opposition committee has raised enough money to be tracked by the FPPC. A couple of local committees did raise about $45,000 for this particular opposition of 24.
So what is Prop 25? Well, as the calmatters.org website puts it, we are essentially being asked whether we want to ditch or keep cash bail. It's kind of counterintuitive on how to vote for this. If you vote yes, you will let the new law, Senate Bill 10, go into effect, which would ditch cash bail. Voting no would keep the system as is. This bill was signed into law and due to go into effect in October of 2019. But bail bond companies circulated a referendum, which is now Proposition 25, in order to block it from going into effect. So under the new law, there would be a risk assessment, and it would categorize each defendant into 3 risk groups: low, medium, and high. And defendants accused of certain crimes would not be eligible at all for release under the new system. No bail money would be required. All of the assessments would be based on risk. Under the current system, you can be released on bail or on your own recognizance. For those that do not have assets or money available, they resort to buying a bail insurance policy. And bail insurance companies typically charge a 10% non-refundable fee of the total amount of bail due. The current system guarantees the right to bail except in certain circumstances. This information comes from the California legislature's nonpartisan fiscal and policy advisor called the LAO. It is only looking at costs and benefits from the perspective of state and local governments, and they do not assess the impact to the commercial bail bond industry. Estimates vary, but if the bill were enacted as originally planned, it would do away with the bail bond industry in California. In 2018, bail posted in state courts amounted to $6 billion, with the bail bond companies receiving about $560 million in fees. The key supporting argument in favor of making this change to the law is that poor defendants are kept in jail because they do not have the means to make bail, and even if they do have the means to make bail and are eventually found not guilty or not even charged, they are still stuck with large debts to pay, as the 10% fee for bail insurance is non-refundable. The key opposing argument for this new law is that people are concerned about the cost and objectivity of the algorithms that will be developed to create these risk assessments, which will be used by the courts for releasing a person from jail pre-trial. And of course, it is helpful to follow the money. According to the California Fair Political Practices Commission, Yes on 25 is a coalition of justice reform and labor organizations. These are the contributors who have provided over $500,000 of support as of September 18th from the FPPC website. The top two are Stephen Ballmer, who was the CEO for Microsoft, along with his wife, Connie. Some other notable groups in support of 25 include California Medical Association, Californians for Safety and Justice, and the League of Women Voters of California. Funding the opposition of Prop 25 are bail bond companies, owners of bail bond companies, and the insurance companies that sell bond insurance products. These are the top contributors that have given over $500,000 as per the FPPC website as of 9/18. A notable group against Prop 25, although they have not provided any funding to the campaign, are California's 3 ACLU affiliates. They issued a joint statement that said, SB 10 is not the model for pretrial justice and racial equity that Californians should strive for. They called for new legislation to address racial bias in risk assessment tools. However, they decided not to align with the bail bond businesses to overturn SB 10. Other notable groups in opposition to Prop 25 include California Peace Officers Association, the California State Conference of the NAACP, and the Crime Victims Alliance. So just to summarize, voting yes on this measure means no one would pay to be released from jail before trial. Instead, you would either be released automatically or not based on your risk assessment. Voting no means some people would continue to pay bail to be released from jail, and other people would continue to be released without paying bail. A no vote essentially is the system, leaving the system as is. If you want some more information, here's a list of nonpartisan election websites, although calmatters.org is a media site with a bias rating of center. Thank you for voting and watching this pros and cons presentation from the League of Women Voters of Fremont, Newark, and Union City.